Another day, another AMD FX related video. What's going on, guys? Hopefully you're not bored with the FX content that I have been posting lately. If you haven't seen the previous videos where I briefly talked about the architecture of Bulldozer and why I think the power of AMD FX was very underestimated, be sure to check them out over here. And while everyone is making videos about Zen 2, today I'm going to be showing you how to overclock an AMD FX processor to squeeze every last bit of performance left in it so you can play the latest titles with reasonable frame rates. I know I may be a little late with this tutorial, yet I was quite surprised to find out that there are still a lot of people out there who use a Bulldozer or a Piledriver CPU in their main system like I do, and surprisingly quite a few of you were actually interested in an AMD FX overclocking guide in one of my recent videos. I expect this video to be quite long because I'm going to be showing you how to overclock your entire system, which means we're going to be overclocking the CPU, North Bridge, as well as the RAM. I've seen plenty of FX overclocking guides, and while there are great and in-depth tutorials that show you how to overclock an FX CPU the right way, there are also many that only teach you how to overclock the core frequency, which is simply not enough for an FX processor because the RAM as well as the North Bridge become the bottleneck. Before getting into overclocking, it would be ideal if you could spare a whole day for this task, as it requires patience and will take up at least half of your day. Keep in mind that overclocking is absolutely safe, though you still may damage your components if you don't know what you're doing, so do this at your own risk, or just carefully listen and double check everything before going any further. We're also going to be checking out results before and after overclocking each component, and without wasting any more time, let's get right into it. First of all, let's make sure that you have parts that can handle overclocking, which means you must have a decent motherboard, preferably with an 8+2 power phase design for overclocking an 8-core AMD FX CPU, and in case you have a 6-core processor, a 6+2 phase motherboard should be enough. A good power supply with plenty of wattage from a reputable brand, a decent tower cooler or a water cooling solution, and of course some good airflow in your case to keep everything nice and cool. For reference, I'm going to be using a Gigabyte 990 FXA UD3 revision 4 motherboard, a 700 watt FSP Hydro power supply, which is right around what you want to have if you own an 8-core FX processor paired with a GPU that consumes about 170 watts, and a Zalman CNPS 14X CPU cooler. You can also apply some fresh thermal paste to your CPU and clean your PC if you haven't done that in a while. Next, let's download all the necessary software we're going to be using, which are Hardware Info 64 and CPU-Z for checking the temperatures, overclocks, etc., Cinebench R15 or R20 for measuring performance increase, and of course, Prime 95 or Intel Burn Test for stress testing. Personally, I find using apps that I frequently work with, such as Sony Vegas or Adobe Premiere, and playing a couple of intensive games for an extended period of time to be enough for stress testing. Though I would also recommend you using Prime 95 or Intel Burn Test just to make sure that you have a stable overclock. It is very important to test a few different software options, because even though it may seem like you're stable using Prime 95, you still may get a crash during a Cinebench run or even while playing games. Talking about Cinebench, I'd suggest running a single and multi-core test before we get into overclocking so that you can compare the performance difference later on. Just before we get into BIOS, you should also be aware that your PC may obviously become unstable, which might cause your system to freeze, or you might get a blue screen. And in case your PC doesn't want to respond at all, feel free to hold the power button or just simply turn off your power supply for a restart. If your PC completely refuses to boot, then the best option would be to reset your BIOS, and the easiest way to do that is by unplugging the power supply and removing the motherboard battery for around a minute, or by just simply shorting the clear CMOS pins on your motherboard for a few seconds. Also, I should mention that even though in this video we're going to be looking at how to overclock an FX 8350, the process is pretty much the same when it comes to 6 and 4 core FX CPUs. Alright, now let's reboot our system, get into BIOS and disable all power saving features as well as other unnecessary stuff first, such as Turbo Core, Cool and Quiet, C6 State, C1E, SVM, and APM Master Mode. I will include some information on the screen where you can find all the settings I'm talking about in case you don't have a gigabyte motherboard like I do. Okay, now we can begin overclocking and let's start with our CPU to see how much we can push it at a given voltage. Let's begin by increasing the multiplier to 21 for a frequency of 4.2 GHz and set the CPU core voltage to 1.375 volts. That's going to be enough for now, so let's press F10, save the settings, and reboot. Now what we want to do is open up Hardware Info 64 and CPU-Z to check if the overclock is correct, as well as some kind of stress testing software to see how stable our overclock is. I'm going to be using Intel Burn Test, and what you want to do here is start it up and make sure that the CPU temperature doesn't go above 70 to 72 degrees Celsius under full load. Both FX 8350 and the 6300 should start throttling at around 80 degrees Celsius, though this number may change depending on which FX CPU you have, I'm not entirely sure. And the only way to learn that is to check if your core frequencies start dropping to around 1.4 GHz under load. Keep in mind that 70 degrees is a good temperature, and you should only get worried if you start getting closer to 75 degrees Celsius. I should also mention that Intel Burn Test causes the VRMs to run really hot, though all of these temperatures are nowhere near what you're going to be getting while using your system most of the time. Some of you may have noticed that the V-core value is actually lower under load than 1.375 volts that we entered in the BIOS. That's called V-droop, which is a safety feature that is not very useful when it comes to overclocking, as it may cause instability issues. And the only way you can reduce the voltage drop is by using load line calibration. Unfortunately, not all AM3 Plus motherboards, such as MSI for example, have load line calibration, and in that case, the only way to compensate the voltage drop is by increasing the V-core even higher. There are also motherboards without the LLC option that don't experience a voltage drop, so this may not be a problem for you at all. To get as close to the V-core value as possible, you need to go back into BIOS and change your LLC to medium if you have a gigabyte motherboard, and as far as I know, also medium or high for Asus motherboards. In case your system was stable throughout the test after changing the LLC setting, feel free to go back into BIOS and set the CPU multiplier to 22 for an overclock of 4.4 GHz. If your PC froze or you got an error message during the stability test, simply go back into BIOS and begin increasing the CPU voltage one at a time until your PC becomes stable. Keep increasing the frequency and adjusting the voltage until you either hit, I'd say, around 1.5 to 1.52 volts on the V-core or a temperature limit of around 70 degrees Celsius under full load. By the way, you should be aware that increasing the clock speed to unrealistic numbers is totally safe, yet exceeding the maximum recommended amount of voltage of a component may cause an irreparable damage. I will stop at 4.5 GHz using 1.456 volts with medium LLC, because I think that it's a pretty realistic overclock that everyone can achieve. Yet, considering that every CPU overclocks differently, you may need more or less voltage for a 4.5 GHz overclock. Okay, now let's have a look at how much performance we achieved by just simply overclocking our FX 8350 to 4.5 GHz.
Every sinner will burn in the eternal fire. Damn it! Can't hear a blasted thing!
8 at the Kingfisher, you're sorted for at least 2.
Stop it! Non-humans exhibit a natural.
After making sure that our CPU is stable, we can move on to overclocking the RAM, which is one of the easiest things to do. Simply increase the memory multiplier one step at a time without changing the voltage for now. If the system is stable after running a stress test and playing a couple of intensive games, you can go back into BIOS and keep increasing the frequency until your PC becomes unstable. If you're experiencing stability issues after overclocking your RAM, just simply begin raising the DRAM voltage by increments of 25 millivolts over the stock voltage until your PC becomes stable again. You can keep increasing the voltage until you hit 1.7 volts, though I doubt you're going to need to go that high because most of you will probably max out at around 2133 MHz, which, unless you're unlucky, shouldn't require anything higher than 1.65 volts. One thing I have to mention is that if you're a Gigabyte user, you won't be able to overclock your RAM at all unless you enable XMP first, because for some reason your PC will completely refuse to boot after overclocking the RAM with XMP disabled. I'm not entirely sure if this is something that only applies to me, but if you're having a hard time overclocking your RAM, this could be one of the reasons why that is. I was able to overclock my RAM to 2133 MHz using 1.55 volts, and let's have a look at how much of a performance increase we managed to achieve.
Help a poor fellow out.
I'd buy tomorrow what you can buy today.
Hey!
Come closer.
Alright, so lastly we have the North Bridge, which is slightly more tricky to overclock than the other two, as the method of overclocking may change depending on which motherboard you have. The first method is by simply increasing the North Bridge frequency, just like we did it before with the processor as well as the RAM. But unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, only Asus and a few Gigabyte motherboards accept this way of overclocking. You can learn if it works for you by increasing the North Bridge frequency slightly above stock and by checking if you're actually running at that frequency in the memory tab of CPU-Z. In case your overclock has not been applied, it means that you're going to need to overclock the North Bridge using the other method, which is by base clock overclocking. The base clock of your system is simply what determines the clock speed of your other components, such as the CPU, RAM, hypertransport, and of course the North Bridge. You can also play around with the base clock frequency instead of other multipliers, not only to increase your North Bridge frequency, but also the clock speed of the CPU as well as the RAM if you wish to do so. Though you have to make sure that all the other multipliers are adjusted correctly when using this method to avoid stability issues. Considering my Gigabyte motherboard does not accept the easy way, I'm going to use the base clock overclocking method to increase the frequency of my North Bridge. First, let's set the NB core voltage to 1.275 volts and begin raising the base clock frequency 5 to 10 MHz at a time until the PC becomes unstable. After playing around with the base clock, I decided to set it to 226 MHz, and considering the Northbridge has a stock multiplier of 11, we should have a clock speed of 2486 MHz. I had to use 1.35 volts to keep my overclock stable, though don't forget that this value may vary from person to person, and you can keep increasing the NB core voltage up to 1.4 volts as long as your Northbridge temps don't exceed 75 degrees Celsius. A couple of other things to mention is that if you have an Asus motherboard, you have an option to change the load line calibration of your Northbridge, which you can set to medium to increase the stability, just like we did it before with the CPU. Finally, if you're using the base clock overclocking method, be sure to lower the hypertransport frequency so that it matches the clock speed of the Northbridge, because overclocking hypertransport doesn't bring any benefits other than increasing heat and power consumption. You can check if the HT frequency matches the Northbridge frequency by using CPU-Z. Okay, now let's have a look at how much of a performance increase we achieved by overclocking all three of our components.
Help a poor fella.
The thinking customer will see right you have the best
Don't touch us!
Eternal fire walking you.
So as we can see, we gained a good amount of performance increase and also improved frame time performance, which is especially noticeable in Witcher 3, where we saw an up to 23% gain over stock. Need for Speed, on the other hand, didn't see as much of an improvement, and that's absolutely fine. For example, you will notice a huge overall increase in performance playing Battlefield 5 because it's a very CPU demanding title, yet in Apex Legends you most likely won't notice a difference as it is mostly GPU bound, so expect to either get an uplift reaching as high as 25% or no increase at all, depending on the game. Comparing the results in Cinebench R15, we can see a decent improvement of roughly 9 and 13% for the single and multi-core performance respectively. Also, don't forget that if you own something like an FX 8320 that has lower stock frequencies, you will notice an overall larger performance boost over stock. Alright, so lastly what we can do is turn some of the power saving features back on and we should be good to go. This is not something that you have to do, nor will this affect your electricity bill much, yet if you want the voltage as well as the frequency of your CPU to drop when your PC is idling, you can enable Cool and Quiet, C6 State and C1E. There is one more thing you're going to need to do though, and that is use offset voltage mode instead of the manual mode that we used for the power saving features to work. Simply go back to your voltage settings, find the offset mode option, in my case it is called Dynamic VCore, and type in the value that you want to be added on top of your stock voltage. As you can see here, our stock voltage is 1.375 volts, and I need 1.456 volts to sustain an overclock of 4.5 GHz, so all I have to do is add 81 millivolts on top of my stock voltage to get a value of 1.456 volts. You can also check if the power saving features work by using CPU-Z. And that's basically it. That's how you overclock an AMD FX processor, and if you have any questions, be sure to let me know in the comment section down below. Don't forget that you can easily push your overclocks even further as long as you haven't reached a voltage or a temperature limit yet. Most AMD FX CPUs can be easily overclocked up to 4.7 GHz, and if you manage to overclock your other components to their limits as well, you will get an even better increase in overall performance. By the way, I recently made a video about how an FX 8350 performs overclocked to 4.7 GHz. That includes more tests, and I'll leave it in the card at the top right corner if you'd like to check it out. Anyways, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you found it helpful, and if you did, be sure to leave a like and share this video to show your support. Also, feel free to support me on Patreon or by simply using the Amazon affiliate links provided in the description down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.